I'm Courtney McDonald, Director of the Land Heritage Coalition of Glastonbury, a member-based nonprofit organization that focuses on local land use issues, open space preservation, and the enjoyment of our natural environment. If you are not already a member, I encourage you to become one by going to our website, lhcglastonbury.org. Thank you for joining us tonight for our talk on knotweed and other invasives. A variety of invasives are rapidly spreading in many areas of town, perhaps in your own neighborhood or even in your yard. I personally have been battling garlic mustard on my property. Some of you may have volunteered last spring for our Ferry Park cleanup of knotweed and garlic mustard. I will again be leading this effort this spring and into the summer. We are very fortunate to have the support of the town of Glastonbury, and more specifically, the Parks and Rec Department and tree warden, Greg Foran. We are hoping to gather volunteers once again to tackle Ferry Park and other town designated areas that have been afflicted by knotweed. If you'd be interested in helping out, please email me. I put my contact information in the chat along with the 2 dates we have scheduled for knotweed days. So if you're interested in helping with that, please do reach out to me. Excuse me. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to ask you to stay muted for the duration of our program. Please type any questions you may have into the chat box at the bottom of your screen so that they can be answered during the question and answer period at the end of the presentation. We will be recording this program. Our speaker, Suzanne Thompson of Nix the Knotweed, has been gardening and battling invasive plants in Connecticut since 2002. She has bachelor's degrees in urban horticulture and journalism from Kansas State University, is a Yukon Master Gardener, a Connecticut NOFA accredited organic land care professional, and serves on the board of the Mountain Laurel chapter of Wild Ones, a national organization that advocates native plants and landscapes. She is also co-leader of Pollinate Old Lyme and is a member of the Old Lyme Solid Waste Recycling Committee. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Suzanne. Welcome, Suzanne.
And it is a delight to get to talk with you this evening. I too have been outside in recent days, earlier today as well, before the rains down here in Old Lyme, battling invasive plants and seeing what native plants are beginning to peek their heads back out this spring. So yes, gardening has been my passion all of my life. First out in Kansas, and then I realized, if I love doing this, I really should study it in college. And that led me, though, to a path of broadcast journalism, agricultural policy, and politics. I worked on Capitol Hill, and I also worked for large agricultural chemical companies because I had this background in horticultural sciences, politics, public policy, and I could understand the chemistry and talk with people and also try to address their issues and their concerns. So I am a person who at times will use chemicals if I think they're the most appropriate tool. Many other times I will not, and I will say, let's be more patient. Let's try some different things. It's like integrated pest management. It's also like human health. You don't keep taking the same antibiotic continually to get well, especially if it doesn't seem to be working anymore. It takes a combination. We live in ecosystems and we're complex organisms, and so is everything else around us. So there is no quick fix. So that's kind of my philosophy to gardening, and my yard probably reflects that too. So I was very fortunate to get to move to Connecticut in the early 2000s. And I was doing communications for the Pfizer company, employee communications and R&D in pharmaceuticals. The corporate merry-go-round ended for me here. I started raising my family and saying, I'm going to get back to doing gardening. But I wasn't from here, so I didn't know a lot about the plants that grew in New England. So I trusted what locals and neighbors and landscapers were telling me. It'd been a few years since I had been involved in dealing with the backyard. And so fast forward to, oh my gosh, 20 years later, I am realizing, I have been observing us being overrun by invasive plants. Now, some people say they've been here forever. maybe I'm just obsessing more, but I honestly think some of the climate shifts and changes that we're seeing, the weeds are happier. The invasive plants, many of them are happier and seem to be growing stronger. You can recognize the Japanese honeysuckle on the left, the mugwort poking out. No, that's not a chrysanthemum that just doesn't have a smell. That's mugwort, as well as deer mile-a-minute vine. And this is at the other end of my development, discovered last summer. Some neighbors innocently asked me, would you come down and look at this thing? And I did. And unfortunately, we found it after it had started to go to seed. So we're all a little mortified because mile-a-minute vine spreads through seeds. It's an annual. And of course, good old bittersweet is everywhere around us, dragging down trees. It truly is the kudzu of the north and covering plants. So these are not strangers to you. But as I said, when I first came here and was busy working, I said, okay, you guys tell me, what do I plant around my house? And they said, well, first of all, you have to deal with the deer. You have to plant things that deer won't eat. We recommend barberry. We recommend pyrus. And, you know, instead of the native dogwood, the Korean kusa dogwood, bigger flowers, flashier, seems to be more disease resistant. Like, okay, vinca and pachysandra were ground covers that people were saying, oh, you should plant those. Viburnums, but they say go for the Korean spice bush viburnum because it has a better fragrance. Yes, there's a lot of native viburnums, but look for that one. And of course, a lot of our crab apples and flowering trees are from somewhere else. Now, a lot of these plants are not invasive, but a fair number of them are. Such as barberry and euonymus. We have English ivy, or actually that's Irish ivy, a neighbor of English ivy, with beautiful blueberries on it. Not invasive here yet. Luckily, I have not seen any porcelain berry, and I didn't listen to anybody if they suggested planting a porcelain berry. But after a couple of years, oh, and then Japanese spirea went in there as well. I did put in some junipers because I'm from Kansas and juniper trees grow there. But I stepped back and I realized as I started paying attention more to different garden speakers and interviewing them, I started doing a radio show and writing garden columns, that my yard was about 80% not from here. And no wonder the deer weren't eating it. And my neighbor couldn't get through the prickly barberry either. That kept her out of my backyard. But it wasn't healthy, you know? And it looked just like everybody else's yard too. And so I started, as I say, down this path of taking the CT NOFA Organic Land Care Professionals course, going to become a master gardener. Really enjoy getting an update on all the classes. I also work with Save the Sound to protect the Oswegatchie Hills Nature Preserve in East Lyme, Connecticut, and to protect an adjoining 236 acres that we're trying to wrestle away from a developer and add to the preserve. And through that, as well as meeting people like Bill Dusing, the founder of CT NOFA, Tom Christopher, a great garden writer and ranter, and Nancy DeBrule Clemente, I began to realize that I've got to be making some changes in my yard. So I have been doing that over the years. And of course, in that process, I came across Doug Tallamy and his Nature's Best Hope, Bringing Nature Home. I remember reading that first book over a winter, just going, okay, I'm gardening for the bugs. Oh, okay. You know, it was like, okay, it took me a little while to turn the corner, but I realized this makes total sense. What we really need to be providing in our yards is native ecosystems that'll support the insects, that support the birds, that support the bees, the bats, and other wildlife. So if you're not familiar with some of these people I've mentioned, their names will be on a list. I will give you like a garden list or a plant list after a garden talk. All the things I'm mentioning tonight, names, URLs, we'll put out on a 1 or 2 page fact sheet. So you don't have to write them down now, but you can just hopefully enjoy the pictures and the information. So, you know, a lot of our discussion now people use the word, oh, that's an invasive plant. And I think they really mean that's a plant that annoys me. I don't like it. Like a lot of people will say, well, poison ivy, it's itchy, so it's invasive. No, actually, poison ivy is a native plant. It feeds the birds. And the way it grows and coexists on the trees here, it doesn't choke and strangle them like Oriental bittersweet does. However, it will cause problems on your skin if you come in contact with it. So it might be a thug or a brute if it's aggressively growing, but plants start on one continent. It's amazing to see how continents have split, and you have cousins of maples and chestnuts on other different continents. You have so many plants that came from Eurasia over here, roses, apples, peonies, tree peonies. Most of the plants are not invasive. I think I've heard it said by one of our, Paul Picone, and one of the Connecticut Deep speakers, wildlife specialists, about 10% of species appear to be on that invasive side, which means they're not from here, they don't have any natural predators, and they're very prolific. And they usually reproduce by more than one means, like a knotweed produces by every means possible, but they're very prolific, and they grow earlier and get a jump on a lot of our desired plants. And that's true with weeds. You can have a weed that came from this continent and it jumps up and crowds out the desired plants, the agronomic crops, the food crops. So just, it could be a native thug. It's not an invasive plant necessarily. It's invasive if other things can't compete with it. And this is where it gets interesting. People just look outside and see green, especially early in the spring, and go, oh, it's greening up. It's like, oh, I hate to tell you, but that's multiflora rose and garlic mustard, which is getting a jump on everything else. Oh, and little wineberries are popping up now too. Learn how to tell the difference. And I have to tell you, it's much easier to do this now than it was back when I was in college. And I'll show you some of the online resources and apps that I love to use. But if you notice, poison ivy, if you don't freak out when you see it, it grows up the tree, and it might circle around close to the main trunk near the top. It's kind of pretty. It turns bright red. It's bittersweet that takes off and grows out on the branches, weights them down, pulls them down in a windstorm. And people a lot of times confuse Virginia creeper, which they say, oh, well, that's disgusting, or it might be poison ivy. 3 leaves or 5 leaves? That's 5 leaves. It's not poison ivy. It also gets pretty and red in the fall. It has little berries. You probably don't want that native plant growing up your brick wall or your wood lattice or things, because it can tend to do a little bit of damage there. You might not want it up growing up your trees, but it's an excellent native creeper to have around, or ground cover. It is more from the southeast. It's moving north. It's happy up here. Something that has come to annoy me greatly is wineberry. And you realize that wineberries do not produce nice tasting berries. That would be your native red raspberry, or a raspberry that you might buy in a garden center is probably a hybrid of a European and a native one. But right there in the middle, they've got luscious, juicy fruits. Whereas wineberry, there's just not a whole lot of fruit and juice to it. So it is one of our 97 invasive plants. It's characteristically different. I'll show you a few more pictures of it, but now is the perfect time to be pulling that out if you see it. The same goes, as I mentioned, the Irish ivy or English ivy. I hope you know not to toss indoor plants. Sometimes you get an English ivy, in a container or a pot or something, and you're like, oh, I'll just throw it outside and let it grow. Well, in the Pacific Northwest, English ivy is considered invasive. It's pretty aggressive around here too, and you will see it spreading around in forests. and its cousin, Irish ivy, really is spectacular. I took that picture at the Old Lyme transfer station. I tend to hang out there and take pictures of plants. Then I pop them up on an app and see if I can identify what they are and learn more of them. But there are so many nice dogwoods that we have here, and that you might have to do a little digging and looking for them, finding a different source. But like silky dogwood has beautiful blueberries. So it's a bush, it's not a vine, but nobody needs porcelain berry when you can have these native berries. So where do you learn this information? I put together this list of great sources that you have here. Audubon's native plants base, you plug in your zip code and up will pop bushes and shrubs for your area. And it will tell you what birds they attract and what those birds eat, as well as the berries of the plant. So that's a great one to play with, plan with, try to figure out what can I plant somewhere. If you want to geek out a little bit more, go to Go Botany. That is a great website that has a lot of information on it. Another good fun one is the Wild Ones organization. And I would encourage you to check it out. It's a national organization, Wild Ones. It started out of the Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Upper Plains. Many of the popular native plants that are promoted do come from the plains. And so it's a different soil, different pH here, but they can adapt and grow here. But you will see a lot of them being suggested as something, especially in a sunny area, for pollinator plants. But I think my favorite app has been iNaturalist, National Geographic, and it is free, number one. So that's great. You go out, you can snap pictures, you can upload them outside if you've got enough bars on your phone, or just wait till you get home and you can upload them. You don't have to identify them in your own backyard. You can do an obscured setting or a totally private setting or a public setting. And the app will tell you what it thinks you found. And then in a day or two, a real live naturalist will come online and will do a verification of it and send you more information about it, which winters are long. I've had fun corresponding with some of the different naturalists who responded and pointed out things about some of the plants that I found. And you can ask a few questions and things, but it's a great source. Seek is a light version of iNaturalist. It doesn't involve human interaction, might give you a quicker answer. I'm not sure if it's as exact, though, certainly. So again, we'll send you those links so you can play with those. So after that epiphany that, oh my gosh, no wonder I don't see that many insects, or the insects that I do see in my yard all seem to be, I don't know, the same aphids, a lot of deer ticks, the same insects were always around all the time. I decided to start paying attention to more native plants, see what was around me. And I discovered on the side of my yard, I dearly love smooth sumac. This is not poisonous sumac. This has berries that stick upward pretty much. They kind of droop later in the winter and they get worn out, but the leaf color is so phenomenal in the fall as they change up. And if you've got like kind of a wild duff area, this don't pull out your smooth sumac there. And you can see the little wings on the side of the stem on it. I hate to say it, but that bright green stuff that's growing in there, that's bittersweet wandering through my Rus aromatica. So no doubt birds have been sitting there and they ate some bittersweet as well and deposited the berries, and they've grown there. I've also added amelanchier or shadblow. Eastern redbud has always been a favorite of mine. I saw one looking out my window growing up in Kansas. So when I had my yard here, I ordered trees from the Arbor Day Foundation in the early 2000s, and sure enough, an Eastern redbud came. But you know what else was included in there, and I hope they're not sending it out anymore, was Bradford pear, which is not a native plant, and it breaks apart. And it might be invasive in some areas, but it's not the best thing. But so many of our streets and trees have them. I really enjoy my Fathergia. which has tremendous fall color in October for a couple of weeks. It also has fun little bottle brush willow flowers in the spring as well. It's surrounded by Ilex glabra, just good old inkberry, which has worked very well and is very disease resistant in the backyard. Some people poo-poo it, but I would plant Ilex glabra at any point, and it also flowers. So it's serving in a pollinator capacity for someone. I haven't looked up every insect that's being benefited by it. A shrub that I have found and really enjoy is the 9-bark, the Physocarpus, and that one is not in my yard. That one happens to be an old sagebrook, so it's bigger than the ones that are in my yard and a better picture. But if you're tempted to put in Asian spirea, search up 9-bark. It has similar flowers. There's a green variety, which is a standard variety, and then also this one with more of the reddish leaves. But it is a lovely native plant to have, and it's very low maintenance. Amsonia, or blue star, puts out great blue flowers in the spring, and then in the fall you'll get a shock of yellow foliage for like a week or so as it changes colors. That's a nice low bush to add, and now it's relatively easy to find. And of course, red osier dogwood is something that's going to provide you red fall twig color. If people say, oh, I can't do without my euonymus, it's like, wait. There are so many other things that'll give you reddish color in the fall. One of those would be the red osier dogwood. The other would be high bush blueberry. And the more you stare at euonymus, you realize how unnatural their red color really is at times. The other native things that have red, it's a little more subtle. It's a little more balanced. So I started plopping more perennials in my yard, and a number of these I found either at conservation district plant sales or land trust sales. And maybe it's some garden clubs, town garden clubs, but I'm finding that your land trusts and specialized groups, Wild Ones does seed sales, can be great sources of different native plants for you. You might be starting out with small plugs, but they will grow. So good old Rudbeckia, black-eyed Susan, also gives you a pretty fall color, subtle browns and reds with the green. Penstemon is a real draw. It's in the middle for pollinators, for bees and wasps. I really enjoy having that in the yard. And then it'll leave a seed pod, a cluster of seeds up that the new shoots are just beginning to pop up out of the ground now. So these are all shots at different times of the year. My newest discovery that I was always kind of like, what do you mean is called a mint? I don't want to plant anything that's a mint because it'll take over, right? Well, mountain mints, Pycnanthemum, are native mints. They're very sturdy plants, and they're subtle but pretty. And it's a good thing to put at the edge of your yard if you're trying to combat some invasive stuff that's kind of coming in. They'll get about 2 to 3 feet tall. So the native ground covers, I'm continually searching for different native ground covers. So the Tiarella, which is right in the middle here with the white spikes of flower. The little white flowers over here, this is woodruff. It is a non-invasive, but it's not native, just a nice shady ground cover that grows very comfortably under pine trees and some shaded areas. It's something that you can work in and it will just do just fine. It's not nearly as aggressive as, say, a juga, which is not native. I'm experimenting with some wild ginger. A lot of times you'll see an Asiatic or European ginger, which has shiny leaves. The American wild ginger, North American, might be a little more difficult to get established and growing a lot, but it has fuzzy leaves and funky little brown flowers. It's just beginning to come out right about now. Wild strawberry, and these do have little strawberries, are a fun ground cover to have, especially if you've got areas that you're happy letting the leaves lie down and just stay there instead of, I really don't spend money on mulch anymore. After all these years of, buying mulch every year, and wondering about the weird mold that was growing on some of it, I realized I didn't garden for mulch, I garden for plants. So I'm learning to use things like natural leaves, like pine needles, and just leave the leaves, let them lie there. May apple, if you've got the setting for it, is a short seasoned ground cover, but it's a fun thing to have popping up. It should be coming up in the next couple of weeks. And we are frozen. So if you'll, there we go. So I'm also a little irreverent, and I encourage other people to do that in your backyard. I freely let the Solidago canadensis or the goldenrods grow in my yard wherever they want to. Well, not in the middle of the lawn, but I find them popping up in the prettiest places. Up top here, a few have nestled inside my hydrangea, and a few are growing right beside them. That's the mountain mint as it's in the fall, as it's turned brown and dark. It has the prettiest seed heads. My favorite is the black cohosh, which starts out looking like a fern at the beginning of the spring. It's just coming out now. It puts out these fragrant tall racemes that I have monarch butterflies and bees all over in August. And it's happy next to my roses. And I found a spot in my yard where the Joe Pye weed can actually grow. And unfortunately, this was taken like 10 years ago, and now everything else has grown up around poor Joe. So Joe needs more light. So I had to divide Joe and move parts of him somewhere else. Someone else I highly recommend if you want to look at some ideas and you live in a shaded area. Heather Bradley is the coordinator of Pollinator Pathways of Guilford, and she is so committed and so knowledgeable, learned so much. She's hung out her own shingle with Quercus Works, a native pollinator garden company. So she just hung out her shingle doing that in the last year or so. But you can see how she has taken Asclepias and all sorts of different asters and monarda, and I think she's got, it looks like these narrow-leafed mountain mint growing as well in her yard. That's her yard. So you've seen where you can find out fun things to grow and to bring into your environment. Let's get on to the invasive stuff. We'll spend the rest of the talk talking about that. These are excellent sources to figure out, is that an invasive plant or not? Now, iNaturalist also will tell you if you're looking at a native or an invasive plant, but USDA is kind of the mothership of information. And of course, a lot of species that are invasive are not just plants, zebra mussels, for example, a lot of insects that we're dealing here within New England. If you haven't seen Connecticut Deep's and Sipwig's invasive plant management calendar, I encourage you to take a look at it. That is continuously being updated by Emmett Verricchio and others. And that tells you when to do what to control the invasive plants. Peter Picone also is an excellent source of information. He gives a lot of talks. If you haven't seen Peter give one of his talks, you can watch a Lyme Land Trust video in the past 6 months. So I love his advice. We can all make a difference one plant at a time. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by invasive plants, just be pragmatic, just be patient. The problems weren't solved in a day, and those invasive plants probably didn't arrive in just one day either. They've probably been hiding out there. One of my favorite sources, since I live in the lower Connecticut River Valley, is our Coastal Conservation District's brochure on invasive plants in your backyard. You can download that. They've just added 4 more invasive plants. And what I really like about it is they help you identify the plant. They talk about mechanical control first. Yes, they do provide herbicide recommendations and advice, but they try to go mechanical first and a combination of the two. So if you're in a different conservation district, you might have a different favorite manual. I'd love to hear about it. So it's Japanese knotweed. I should ask, but I can't see all your hands. How many of you have Japanese knotweed? It's probably most of you. I don't know, but maybe it's the garlic mustard as well. you know, it's so easy to identify. I have to call this the gateway invasive weed. It grows so fast, it's almost an affront to us every spring, how it just keeps shooting up. The little reddish stems, the little reddish leaves and veins you might innocently see poking up in your yard. If knotweed is already there, then you're going to see these big protruding bamboo-esque stalks popping out right about now. You get to midsummer and oh my God, this stuff is 10 to 12 feet tall. It's crowded everything else out. And you get to August and it's blooming. So it was brought over here in the early 1800s and also brought over to England and Europe. It was one of these things that just sounded, oh, this is too good to be true. It's pretty. There's even variegated colors. It has flowers and it grows up and then it dies down and it'll come back next year. Well, the problem is every year that comes back, it's getting bigger and stronger and it's growing. And I'd heard, okay, well, deer won't even touch it. I always put on different sprays for deer ticks, but I've never had found a deer tick on myself while I've been working in knotweed. Even with the sprays on me, I've found deer ticks on me whenever I'm anywhere else. So that's one good attribute. And I guess deer ticks don't hang out on it, but Japanese beetles do. Maybe they are a natural predator of it, but the Japanese beetles are doing a worse number on my roses and everything else. So I do not view them as a viable natural control for knotweed in our country. And because it is not from New England, not set up for this climate, the first hard frost is going to kill it. And it's going to look like this all through the winter, except for the ailanthus, two big ailanthus stems you see sticking up right in the middle of this picture. This is roadside and old lime. So these are ways that you can identify it at every stage of growth. At this point, everything above ground is dead and frozen off. So that's not going to resprout, but the roots are very viable. Knotweed is spread all over North America, and it's a real problem up in Alaska. It is some different varieties have hybridized together. So that may be reducing the viability of the seeds, but it may not. So you could have knotweed that could spread very easily by seed, as well as the roots and the rhizomes. And you may have some seeds that aren't that prolific, but you can see it's all over Canada. It's all over the East Coast. I was out in Colorado and I saw it out there. I don't know why Wyoming doesn't have it, but I'm sure it will. Quite a problem up in Maine as well. So it's on many states' invasive plant lists. When you get over to England, it causes quite the panic. You can't get a mortgage loan on your property unless you've gone and certified that you don't have knotweed growing there. And it becomes very expensive to do these remediation techniques where they just go through and sift through and sort through all of the substrate in the soil to get the roots out. So there's a panic over there in terms of what are we going to do about this stuff. It's also a problem in Australia. So it's something to be taken seriously. The good news is that at least it's not itchy. It doesn't have thorns and the sap is not going to cause a problem. It is a food crop. So my dear friend Petey Reed, Perennial Harmony Gardener, Gardening Center, and now an organic land care company, for years has been testing out this method. She lives in this little community called Pine Grove in the village of Niantic in East Lyme. It's right on the Niantic River between Waterford and East Lyme. It drains right into Long Island Sound. And the hillside on this little beach community was just covered with knotweed. She and the neighbors did not want to use chemical herbicides because they were afraid they would wash right down into the Niantic River. And she happens to be allergic to it as well. So she said, you know, I am going to figure out, I've read different ways about how if you cut this stuff back 3 times a year, that's called carbohydrate deprivation. It stunts the plant back enough that over time, at 3 years, you are going to just about do away with it. You're going to have to keep roguing and looking for individual plants, certainly, but you'd have to do that anyway if you were spraying, because it still keeps escaping a lot of different methods. So they started doing this over 10 years ago. They said, let's keep it easy. because they had a bunch of beach going people who lived in the cottages in this little community. So the idea was cut it down 3 times a year. All you need are clippers, gloves, plastic bags, and oh, by the way, bug spray, water bottle, sturdy boots. And let's go out and chop the knotweed. And because Connecticut has incinerator plants, we could put the cuttings in plastic bags and pop them in the incinerated waste stream. Timing was based on letting it get up to a certain level of growth by late May, early June, Memorial Day weekend, cut it all the way down to the ground. And that's how tall that stuff will get if it's an old established growth of a few years or more. Come back in mid-July, it's going to be significantly shorter but bushier. Cut it down again. Come back in mid-August and cut it down a 3rd time. Chances are it will not have bloomed by that time because you've stunted it back so many times. Do that for 3 years and you are releasing the native seed bank that is there. And she also said, I don't think people need to obsess and do this every day in the same patch. Just let it grow up, cut it down. Wait a few weeks, let it grow up, cut it down, go live your life, go do other things. The frustrating thing with knotweed is that stems will resprout, roots, rhizomes will resprout. And this is one of our problems along roadsides where road crews will come in and mow it repeatedly and scatter the little fragments. They'll wash down into the river and they'll float somewhere else, or they get blown across the road, they'll get carried up the road. A lot of the times our practices of mowing utility scale really is just help spread a lot of insects, pests, plant seeds, diseases. Another thing is if you attempt to try to dig out the roots, which can easily go past 20 feet deep, they seem to almost be stimulated by the breakage and being broken apart. Yes, you're taking out some organic matter and you're pulling the roots out, but you're also disturbing the soil bank. You might be causing erosion problems, a lot of hard work. So the idea is disturb it less, just cut it back. Pesticides, you may end up using as many applications, years of applications of pesticides as trying the cutting method, depending on how strongly established the plants are. And glyphosate, which is very popular, is kind of the used product. It is a contact herbicide, systemic, that anything that is going to land on, it is going to get translocated down to the roots and kill or damage the plant. So it is not selective, it is broad spectrum. So it might be the right thing in some places, but if you're trying to get the knotweed in amongst other plants in your yard, you're going to have to paint it on the leaves almost. If you're going to paint on the leaves, you might as well cut the leaves off. So they started with a small spot, 100 by 40 feet. That's what it first looked like. And that's the water drainage down over the other side of the road that they were afraid that they did not want to let chemicals go down in there. By the 3rd year, so that would have been 9 cuttings of this area, they had phlox, Virginia creeper. Yes, there's still some bittersweet popping up there. Some people have thrown in some daylilies and other things. You're going to see some bittersweet and some other things. The practice, the idea was just go after one of the weed species, the invasive species first. Throw down some native plant seeds as well, but don't exhaust yourself trying to kill everything off at once and see what comes back. And it's really interesting to see. Now they did go ahead and scatter in some more flower seeds, some rudbeckia, probably looks like some Queen Anne's laces popped up in there, some Shasta daisies and other things. But instead of being a monoculture, it is coming back to more of a balanced planting of different things. They also noticed pitch pines, which are native to Pine Grove, also started coming up and surviving. They have to grow up in the sun. They grow best on rocks and open spaces. So, people thought they were nuts that they kept doing this. It did take a commitment. It did take patience. So she kept telling me that, Suzanne, this is working. And I'm like, yeah, I'm too busy. I have kids, I'm working, I've got a garden, all these social activities and on too many commissions that I can think of. And then COVID hit. And like everybody else, we were all shut down in 2020. you couldn't go out and meet at your garden club or anything. Your kids and your spouse were home underneath your feet. Everybody was, living in the same space. But as my friend pointed out, gardening was declared an essential business activity or an essential service. So we said, wait a minute, we'll just go out and be garden crews. We'll put on masks in 2020, stay apart from each other, but let's go out, get together in the evening and start chopping down knotweed in some test areas, be a chance to get together, see if this really works. So, and we did everything, we bootstrapped it. A Facebook, Nix the Knotweed Facebook page, a YouTube channel. My college babysitter was stuck home from college, so she started whipping up videos as we did how-tos for people. And it really caught on. We were kind of surprised the number of people that started commenting and were trying it. The sites that we picked out here in Old Lyme, the Lyme Art Association grounds, had been overtaken. There had been some nice native plants there before, but this one area had just been mowed, once a year or so next to the parking lot, and the knotweed was just marching in, taking back. Old Lyme Land Trust, meanwhile, had started following this practice themselves in a preserve on the Connecticut River. And behind our town hall, we had a slope down into the marsh that one of the guys said, we should have just filled in that wetland. To which I'm like, no, let's try to control, let's leave the wetland. Let's try to mechanically control the knotweed and see how far we get. So it truly became a social activity where we would organize people, put out a Facebook post, sign up garden club members, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, master gardeners, and say, okay, 5 o'clock Monday night, we're going to meet at this site and let's chop down the knotweed. We would work about an hour because you're going to get exhausted, and it was good to see each other. And then you'd go back and wait, and maybe come the next week and work the patch next to it. And we found, especially the first time when you're cutting the knotweed, when it's the big tall stuff, you're going to need long handled loppers. You can use that circular blade brush cutter. Don't use the filament weed whacker that's going to scatter everything everywhere, but you can come in, it's motor operated, and do a clean slice and cut the big stems. So we continued to, that's the apparatus that he had his goggles and his protective eyewear and earmuffs and everything. So we found different strengths for different people who wanted to cut what. This was after a couple of cuttings. Look how skinny the knotweed is. It's not the big stems anymore. It's getting smaller every time. And we also got frustrated with the standpoint that it was a lot of plastic bags. We're like, we don't feel like environmentalists that we're putting this stuff in plastic bags, but we have to figure out ways to kill it off. So we said, let's tarp it. Let's put it between two tarps, make sure the pieces don't float away, and let's see if we can solarize it. This is what the area looked like by September. The first year we did it, 3 rounds of cuttings closest to the little river stream that ran through there. Joe pieweed was coming back. A certain number of grasses were coming back. Ferns, cardinal flower popped up. Cattails popped up that we hadn't noticed before. Jewelweed. And then it was obvious that somebody had planted some of the silky dogwood and other trees in the back and elderberries. So they were beginning to creep back out. We went a year later. So this was year 2. So that would have been 6 cuttings. By this time, the knotweed was short, stunted stuff. We did not attempt to take out the foxtail, which most people are not going to want. Some of these are transitional grasses and things. This really is a test area to see what comes back. But if we had burdock, cockleberry, cockleburr, things like that, we would cut those seed pods out as well. But you can see after 2 years, those stems, they're skinnier than my little finger now. And the native plants keep coming back. So I'm excited to see this spring. We're going to start throwing down seeds now. And we didn't throw down seeds because we kept walking in the area. And we just truly wanted to see, if this is your yard or something, then you might want to go ahead and reintroduce plants a little bit earlier on. But I would go with small plugs and I would try to get some seeds down first. So last year, the Whalebone Cove, Friends of Whalebone Cove people who go out and pull trappa, water chestnut, and hydrilla out of Whalebone Cove on the Connecticut River decided they also wanted to try the Nix the Knotweed method. And they've got a big patch there that's about as big as the Pine Grove one. And Pine Grove started with 100 by 40 the first like 10 years ago. They've now extended a half a mile. They controlled the first area. The next year they started to move on to a next one. 2 years later, they moved on to a next one. They still have to go back to the original one and rogue and check to make sure the knotweed is not coming back, but they have been able to move down the riverbank. And I think that you'll see that here at Whalebone Cove too. So they didn't try to tackle all of that space. So Diana Fisk, who actually is the one who put me in touch with Courtney, I laughingly say, okay, you guys have it right. This is surf and turf. I get to go out in the summertime and paddle and pull up trappa with you. And then also, you know, let's do a little bit of knotweed in between those two things. So they've cleared some areas. They'll be back this year for more of it. We're also experimenting in East Lyme at Vet's Field next to the Oswegatchie Hills Nature Preserve. This is year one. Last summer, they just cut the long pieces, wrapped them up in black tarps. Well, somebody walked off with their tarps. Very frustrating. So they said, it was something to do with the public work guys. You know, they said, we're going to take it away and put it in a pile and sequester it and watch it, make sure it really dies. We'll bring your tarps back sooner or later. Well, they didn't. So they went out and bought a bully bag, which the trick of the bully bag is, you know, maybe you pay 40, 50 bucks for the bag, you dump stuff in it, and then you probably pay 400 or 500 bucks for it to be hauled away. And the cost comes in the transit of the trash, like industrial builder's waste. So they just went ahead and laid the knotweed in the bully bags and put tarps over them and just let them die down. And, you know, it's pretty ugly little stretch once they cleared this all down. It was backing into somebody's yard and it was below the baseball field, and they're worried that it was going to start sprouting through the baseball field. We'll be back this year on year two to inventory, see what's going on, and figure out, are we going to start throwing down some seeds and other things? So we felt like we had a pretty good pattern going with what we were doing with these sites. We're seeing some initial progress, good progress. It will be very frustrating the first time you cut it and it all grows back, but just trust me, just keep cutting it. The bigger challenge is we in Connecticut have to figure out, what do we do with our waste? And I had not realized that 22% of our municipal waste is actually food scraps. Green wet waste. It really shouldn't be going into incinerators, which is what we use in our state. 11% more is other green waste, and that includes invasive plant propagules, because the invasive plant laws say put your invasive plants in a plastic bag and incinerate the propagules. At least here for Mira, which you're in the Mira zone, and so is Old Lyme, you know, it's going to be shutting down. I guess we're all negotiating with other incinerators or haulers. This is uncharted territory for us, but we have to figure out how to divert our waste differently. It would be a real shame for us to be, and just ridiculously expensive for us to be hauling our municipal waste, including our food scraps, including invasive plant parts, to, I don't know, Ohio or South Carolina, where they have the same invasive plant problems. And so we've got a bigger challenge on our hands to figure out, number one, what do we do with plant materials if we don't want them? And what do we do with all of our trash, and how do we handle our waste stream? So just when you thought you had it easy, you know, we thought we'd come up with a solution. We started playing around last summer, knowing that Mira would be shutting down. And the Lime Food Share Garden said, we're trying to smother mugwort. So I said, oh, you're 2 miles away from my sites. Can we drive our knotweed down to your mugwort, lay it on top of there in June, July, August, and just let the mugwort, maybe we're killing your mugwort. We certainly killed off the knotweed. And at that point, except for that one green stem that's sticking out there, you could actually monitor cuttings like this and make sure they die off over the summer. What I'd love to see is like a silage pit or a dumpster or something that you just put the invasive plants in, let them die off, die down. It's going to take management, watching it. We got kicked off of that site because in October, they built their raised garden beds. So whether or not their mugwort really died off, they added raised beds and other things, and I had to get my knotweed out of there. But it was an interesting experiment. We're trying to figure out some other things. How are we going to break this stuff down? How are we going to keep the carbon local, for Pete's sakes? And how are we going to then support the native ecosystems that we really want? So some of the things we've been kicking around, some of us plant people are going, it's like, how can we get town transfer stations to establish a solarizing pit or a dry down area or something that you take all of your invasive plants? Then somebody said, oh, how about worms, vermiculture? Well, that might be an option. That's certainly an option for food waste. I've heard a lot of opinions from people saying that goats might eat it raw. I've heard that goats might actually do a better job of eating thornier, bramblier kinds of invasive plants. But I don't know if we have enough goats, frankly, in Connecticut to do all of that. And but that could be an option. Or we know of some places that are trying to feed their food scrap waste once it's steam treated to pigs. Could you mix in knotweed, maybe not all other invasive plants, and could it be eaten by animals? Of course, you have, anaerobic digesters, which are probably more expensive than mirror waste costs. And there could be an exciting opportunity of biochar. Now, we're in a situation here in Old Saybrook next door. A startup company plans to be doing biochar with wood chips and wood materials starting in May. I don't want to jinx it. I don't know if they've received all their permits yet, but they could be an attractive alternative cost-wise to taking your wood chips and your trees and whatnot to the transfer station, and they get hauled somewhere, turned into something, or they get turned into wood chips that could be contaminated with invasive plant seeds and things. If indeed the wood and the wood chips could be turned into biochar, and that could be used for agricultural purposes, then that might be an option as well. What I'm running into is a lot of people are saying, wait a minute, we don't want to turn biochar into something that chops down all of our trees to feed the biochar processors. So there's got to be a balance there of are we growing things to turn into biochar, or are we using biochar to get rid of things we don't need? So our plans as we go into the next few weeks, we will be resuming Nix the Knotweed 2022. I just met today with the Master Gardeners of New London County and Middlesex County, and we'll be organizing chopping parties at some of our different sites in Lyme and Old Lyme. I welcome other people if they want to take on or continue this. I'd love to turn this into a more structured citizen science project where we actually measure, does it make sense to cut 4 times in the summer? Can we still cut September 1? I'd love to do some side-by-side comparisons of, okay, chop it in the spring and let it grow back and spray it with an herbicide in the fall. That's one of the recommended protocols. How do these compare with each other, and how do they compare cost-wise, as well as how do they compare time commitment? And then, of course, if you're making the choice, no, in this particular site, I don't want to be using herbicide products, is this a realistic alternative? But I honestly think it is for small spaces and yards and things where you don't know what you're doing. You can learn about your plants and then figure out how to control them through mechanical controls. So I also wanted to just show you some of the other things that we're doing with some of the other invasive plants. And maybe you've had some experience with these as well. What I get a kick out of, people think that gardeners know everything and don't make any mistakes. Well, gardeners may kill off more plants than a lot of other people in the process, some intentionally, some not so. But the whole point, we're gardening for nature's sake and for our own sake. Hopefully we're not trying to keep up with the Joneses, and we're not trying to come up with a yard that is more work than it is worth. So this is the time now to be pulling out the barberry euonymus multiflora rose. Weed wrenches, I think, are no longer in existence by that name. They're orange, but you might find white ones that operate the same way, and it's called an uprooter. An extractigator is a smaller version of that methodology, where you clamp the root ball, the base of the plant, and you rock it, you squeeze it together and you rock the extractigator back and forth, and you work it out of the ground. I love my little New England weeder hand tool to go ahead and get the little versions of all of these guys, but get out there now and get those. Learn what an invasive bittersweet looks like at all stages. Those little shoots right there on my glove with the characteristic orange roots, and the leaves always start out a little cluster or whorl right at the top. Garlic mustard, this is the time to be pulling garlic mustard. Remember that it's a biennial, and so it's only going to bloom the second year. The point is, you want to control the seeds as well. Wine rose, this is the perfect time to be wiggling and pulling out those disgusting things. They're popping up everywhere. They actually look kind of pretty, but they're not. And of course, and mugwort, this is the time too to start getting out the mugwort, as much of the fibrous roots as you possibly can. You know, pull them now, pull them later. They're competing with everything else that you have growing. So this was wine rose at midsummer last year. Still pretty easy to pull out, very frustrating to deal with. Needs to be burnt somewhere or biocharred somewhere or allowed to decompose. Again, garlic mustard, if you miss cutting off the flowers, do try to cut off the seeds. So this is more like June, mid-June. Very characteristic seeds. Get out the plastic bag and at least get those seeds so you're not spreading the plant more. The same thing goes with mugwort. You know, anything that you don't want to have spread, cut it off before the seeds spread. Same goes with that mile-a-minute vine that we're going to be watching closely to see just how far and how bad it is. Something to bear in mind, once something has set seeds and you start spraying it with like a contact herbicide like glyphosate, unfortunately, if the seeds are there, the glyphosate's not going to kill the seed. It's actually used as a dry down agent in food crops. So if you're spraying late in the season thinking you're killing the annual mile-a-minute vine, you're killing the vine that's going to die anyway, but those seeds are probably still viable. So the herbicide's not designed to kill a seed once it is set. It'll help dry it down not much quicker. So I'm obsessing with mile-a-minute vine. Always remember, a weed is a weed, so remove the seeds. If you don't want something in an area where it's growing and you've run out of time and you don't want to pull it out of the ground, and maybe you're only stirring up the seed bed, when you do that, go ahead and get out the clippers and remove the seeds as much as possible. So it's a different mindset of thinking. It's like, I'm not going to eradicate that plant totally. I'm just going to stop it from spreading. And yeah, I'll be back. It'll be back, but I'll be back too. So I learned my love of gardening from my dear father. May he rest in peace. He was a Kansas farmer. He kind of took a balanced approach. That's why he had everything growing together. I try to emulate that to a certain degree, but to see, I like to push the limits a little bit too, and see what I can get to grow together. But the idea is focus on native plants as much as you can and reintroduce them into our environment. So if you want to get involved with Nix the Knotweed, you've got my email address here, my phone number. Go like our Facebook page. We haven't posted any videos yet for this year, but we'll probably be doing that. I would really love to collaborate with others and see if we can get some comparisons of what's working. How can we make this work better? Or is this just not working for you at all? there may be situations where, yeah, you know what, we're just going to have to obliterate this stuff with something a little bit stronger. But try a balanced approach with it. So let me stop sharing my slides there.
So, Suzanne, that was great. I think we have a couple of questions if you'd be willing to answer some.
Sure.
I can go ahead and read one. So the first question is from Karen. Beekeepers love knotweed and other invasives. How do we as pollinator pathway advocates explain our concern about these?
Yeah, that is a tough one from the standpoint. Well, we can look at it a couple of different ways. I don't think that we need to let any one invasive species take over all roadsides and riverbanks. There may be areas where it makes sense to let those plants grow. There certainly are other areas where we don't want those plants to be. So whatever we do, we're never going to annihilate all the knotweed. It's here. It's here to stay. It's all over Canada. I will never be able to eradicate it. But I don't think that we should just say, oh, it's like kudzu in the South, we're just going to let it overtake everything. There's got to be areas where we protect certain ecosystems. There's got to be other areas where we can never afford to balance them and maintain them.
And are natives always a better option than allowing an invasive to continue to grow, even if the invasive does, in this case, provide food for bees?
Yeah, from the standpoint that, I mean, we could talk all night about this. We have Calves Island in the lower Connecticut River where the tree swallows murmurate and swoop down into this island of invasive Phragmites. That is the coolest thing to see. Now, we don't want the Phragmites taking over the rest of the Connecticut River, but we sure would hate to lose that island and all that it represents. So the other thing too is I think you have to look at the costs and how hard would it be to take back some areas. So again, it's never going to be the way it was. We're always going to have plants moving and migrating around. We just don't have to have them take over everywhere.
Okay, and our next question is, at the first of the 3 annual cuttings, how large should the plant be? How tall?
Yeah, tall enough that you are taking off a lot of nutrients with it. I would not wait. If you wait until July to cut an established grove, it's going to be 12 feet tall. Right now, this week or so, you're going to see 5 or 6 of these obnoxious sprouts coming up. I'd wait till after Mother's Day. And then here in coastal Connecticut, then you've got enough growth going on it. You've got that big apical stem and you cut it off and the plant's going to get confused and have 5 or 6 little shoots coming out of that. You're exhausting the plant by doing this. So, I'd let it get like, I should say, about 3 to 4 feet tall. Some people, I'm finding people who are like, oh, I just bought a house in the last 2 years, moved out to the country. And now I see this stuff popping up in my yard and they're freaking out about it and feeling like every day they have to cut every stem. And I'm like, well, if it's annoying you that much, okay, but let it get up to a stand about 3 feet, cut it down, let it come back up, cut it down. I say, think like a deer eating your favorite plant.
So there is a big patch on Cedar Ridge Drive at Cedar Ridge Terrace that is mowed by the town 3 or 4 times every summer because it just grows back to the same original height and crowds the road. This has happened for many years. There's been no reduction in the size of the problem. So the cut parts have not been picked up for disposal, but would that really make the difference?
It could. It certainly could. You don't know. So I would tend to think.
And Kathy, I'm going to say, I will reach out to the town on this one because if the town mows it, they may well be willing to pick up those cuttings as well. So I will follow up with them on that. Sorry, the next question is, can knotweed waste be composted?
Very carefully, I would say not. I would rather see it dead and dried out totally, then I'll throw it in my compost heap. It's going to be some of the brown stuff. It's not going to be the green stuff. I would not use it as green. That's what, like I say, I'm from Kansas, a silage pit. All I want is concrete with drainage. I want to put this stuff in that space, maybe cover it up, fry it in the sun in the summer, freeze it in the winter. And once that, flip it some, it's going to be dead after that. But that's a management project that takes up space, you know.
How can we get neighbors to control knotweed that comes into our yards?
Kind of like bamboo. Yeah. You know, you can talk with them about it. You can keep cutting it on your side, maybe showing some other pretty plants that they might want to try planting instead. Maybe they're choosing to do herbicide control on their side. You're choosing to do cutting on your side. You know, the issue is the invasive plant here. You know, glyphosate is used on food crops. Yes, the state of California thinks it's a carcinogen, but I honestly think careful use of it next door to you while you're combating it, whatever method you choose, if it's mechanical, okay, but you're cutting it back, you're controlling it. Just don't let them dump it across the road. It spreads somebody else.
If you pull garlic mustard early before it goes to seed, can they just go in the compost or do they have to go in plastic bags?
They should be able to go in the compost, but what I would do, try to compost your weeds separately from your other stuff that you know is not invasive. Maybe you get a separate composter bin just for the invasive stuff, or a wire cage just for it. As you know, trust no one, assume nothing. My friend Kathy Connolly, the garden writer, she's like, I just have an invasive weed pile. I just keep piling invasive weeds on top of each other and they smother each other out. And I'm like, man, you're brave. I have bittersweet growing through my compost pile. You know, I see stuff popping up in my compost pile. So it takes some active management and paying attention to it.
Now, what about bishop weed? How should that be treated?
I'm not, what's the, I gotta look up bishop weed. Where's my eye naturalist? What's bishop weed? I'll get back to you on that.
That's actually my mother, so I'll have her research it while we're while we're answering the next question. So there is a big knotweed stand at Rotary Field. The town mowed it late last fall when it was fully mature and dying off. Did this do any good? It looked mighty healthy this spring. Do we need to inform the town about proper procedures?
Right. By the time, so the standard practice is, if you have time, if there's not been a hurricane or a snowstorm, and you have time to mow in the spring, go out and mow it, chop it all up and mow it. And if you have time and town money in August, go spray it. But again, if there's a hurricane or something like that, the town crew is probably not going to show up. But that late fall mowing was probably too late to stop any carbohydrate deprivation. The idea is, I think the glyphosate recommendation is spray it when it's flowering. You know, wait till August when it's flowering, and that drives the beekeepers insane. Although glyphosate, I don't think it directly affects bees as a non-target species, but then you'd have glyphosate residue in your honey. So, you know, you're spraying herbicide on insects. It's probably not good for them, but it's not designed to kill them directly. Yeah, so that recommendation of chemically spraying it when it's blooming bothers a lot of people.
Do we think it would make sense for the town or property owners to mow down knotweed when they know, like very, very early season, probably it's a little late now, but let's say, you know, late March, to just mow down the dead stuff so that basically it's easier to access the stuff that's coming up in this early season?
Right. Yeah, and instead of mowing, again, I love a long-handled lopper, and you go in, snip, 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 snip on the bottom, and you clear it out. Then you can see the new stuff. Depending on what the mower is doing, if it starts to catch the little tender fragments, shoots that you're supposed to be able to harvest and pickle or make into a buckle or something. I made knotweed vodka. Okay. I didn't waste the sugar on a dessert with the knotweed. I just went straight for infusing it in vodka. It was tasty, but I'm not going to make a living out of doing that. So yeah, go in and clean the stuff out early, especially, yes, if you're like going to go groom or care for an area, steward an area, this would be the ideal time, even now, to go in and remove the dead stuff. And you can go ahead and remove the first live green cuttings. I've been out of state for like a week, but now I've come back and I've seen pieces are like 3 and 4 feet new growth tall.
I think someone who's seen one of your previous talks asked that you mentioned the pumpkin seed idea.
Right. So some researcher in Pittsburgh had done some work on this at Penn State, and I haven't found the paper, where they were throwing down cucurbit seeds, pumpkins, and any cucurbit supposedly has an allelopathic effect on knotweed. So I talked with a couple of garden writers over there. They said, well, we have such a bad deer problem that when we threw the pumpkins out into the knotweed areas, the deer just ate all the pumpkins anyway, because I knew that deer would eat my squash and pumpkins. So I haven't seen a good definitive study on that. So I did tell people, is like, hey, if you want to give it a try, we're really trying to make this fun and educational. I love the whole pollinator pathway idea, but that has been largely about what to plant in sunny areas for your butterflies. You know, and it's like, well, what about all these people that have trees? What about all these people that already have invasive plants growing? If you don't address those first and get them comfortable with identifying different plants and understanding what grows when and where, you're missing all the fun of gardening. You know, so the idea was, let's make it a social activity. Let's get people together. So that's where pumpkin smashing also was like, let's get together in the fall and throw some pumpkins on a hillside. So we did. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what comes up.
I think we might just have one last question. Can new knotweed sprouts be hit with a blowtorch flame to kill the growth?
It's not going to kill the roots. I've used a blowtorch on mugwort and it's very satisfying. You spray it with a hose and then the other person runs by and torches behind it and it crisps up just like kale, you know, but that didn't kill the mugwort roots either. But the whole problem with knotweed is, this is why systemic herbicides are attractive, but they don't seem to be really that successful. I just think 20 feet of roots, I don't think it can translocate far enough down the root to kill the whole root ball. And equally, pouring vinegar on it will do nothing. People think, oh, I can kill it with vinegar. Vinegar only burns what it touches, acetic vinegar. It has no systemic action. And so burning it also is going to have no systemic action. It's those roots that are running 20 feet away that are saying, oh, I just got disrupted over here. I better send a shoot up over there. I want to survive. The idea of cutting off the stems with as least disturbance as possible, you're just taking the calories away from them, the carbohydrates away from them.
What is the best practice so far in dealing with the cuttings, especially since you've tried several approaches?
Yeah, well, by far the easiest thing was to stick them in a plastic bag and send them to the incinerator and let somebody else worry about their air quality. We've also, I was really surprised how easily it worked to lay those cuttings at the food share garden on top of a tarp, put another tarp or plastic on top of it in July, and they cooked very quickly. It was hot last summer. So I think that there are dry down methods that could be done. It's going to involve a little human labor, some person going in there and stirring it around and going, oh, there's a green stem, I'm going to take that one out, and having the space to do it. You know, we're clean plate people. We want to put the trash away. We want to wipe our plates off clean. We may need a pile over there for stuff to be managed down. I'm really hopeful the biochar situation will work, and that we could set up situations where we could do collections and take it to the biochar facility, or the biochar company is looking at setting up a small processor at a landfill or at a transfer station, so people could bring in their brush and it would go into the cooker, the heater, and out the bottom comes biochar. We'll see if this one little company can figure that out, and that would be very promising.
Yeah, can you expand a little bit on biochar?
Well, no, I don't know enough about biochar. So the name of the company is Blue Sky, BLUSKI, and I am sure that the president, Will Hessert, would love to come and talk with you guys in coming weeks, because I want to talk with them, because he said, once we're up and running, I'll take your knotweed. I'm like, fine, I'm 3 miles away over the bridge. I'll be there. So, and we're actively discussing how he could set up a processor at the old lime transfer station. It heats the plant materials up to 1300 degrees. They go up a conveyor belt into a big cooker tube. They kind of go down it. It heats it up. It dries it out. It doesn't take a real long time, but out the bottom comes charcoal. And it's a low oxygen controlled environment. So there's very little wood ash and no smoke. And the fuel, so they will strip off and, catalytic converter scrub a methane type gas. And they will also collect the plant fat, plant oils, and turn that into a biofuel. And so you've got a fuel, you've got methane gas that can be used, repurposed, and then you've got the biochar that could be used in agricultural soil amendments. So, but I would love to learn more about that. I think it'd be so cool if we could have, some closed loops here, where that's what we're doing. Every town's got a wood pile after a hurricane. And landscape contractors have wood chips. There's good wood chips, and then there's really bad stuff. And so how do we cook up the bad stuff that's full of all the invasive seeds and turn that into biochar? And they're either burying and sequestering the charcoal or using off the other products. That's the model. I'd love to see more about that.
So, sorry, I'm going to skip ahead from one of the questions up. Do you know whether the methane gas can all be recovered, since it's a terrible greenhouse gas?
Right, see, and that's the thing. That's the question. So we're being told, yes, in this method, it's going to be, versus, there's still methane flares at out.
Can the dried stalks of knotweed be burned?
Depending on what your town fire department tells you, yes. And that is a situation where there are so many different silos in this whole thing. We got the plant people that say one thing, put the invasive plants in a plastic bag, you're fine. You got the waste management people going, this is not a landfill anymore, this is a transfer station. You can't leave that wood here. It has to go somewhere else. We're not a holding tank anymore. And then you've got the other people going, yeah, I'll charge you this an industrial waste fee to burn it. And I'm like, whoa, wait, no, this is valuable carbon. We got to do the right thing with it. Would you guys please talk with each other? And then you had the trash hauler going, you can't put plant parts in your trash, but if you put it in a black plastic bag, I'll never know, lady. And I'm like, come on, I may be Dorothy from Kansas here, but can we figure this out?
Well, I think we've run through all of our questions. So Suzanne, thank you. This was really educational, certainly for me. I hope everyone enjoyed it. So thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us.